It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back to a podcast by George. Got a good one today. These episodes with Captain John Cox, I like him so much I replay them and watch them myself. I mean, I really like this stuff, and he's joining us on the podcast by George live line. Captain John Cox is a veteran major airline corporate and general aviation pilot. He has flown over 14,000 hours with over 10,000 in command of jet airliners. Additionally, he's flown as an instructor, a check pilot, and a test pilot, in addition to his extensive involvement in global air safety. He is the aviation expert that media worldwide turns to for insight on breaking aviation news. And of course, he authors a weekly column in USA Today entitled Ask the Captain that I never miss. And we're just delighted to have him back. Captain, welcome back to a podcast by George.
George, good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you know, we talk a lot about the pandemic and particularly about the vaccines and a lot of stuff from the medical perspective as we try to, stagger along here. It's been a long slog. It's been over a year, but a lot of folks now are becoming fully immunized. They're vaccinated, particularly the older folks that like to fly, they like to travel, and they're wanting to hit the turnstiles at the airports again. And I saw some news this week that I wanted to talk to you about as far as seating on the planes are concerned. Everybody's concerned about that because that's you got to sit and you want to be comfortable on these planes. It looks like Delta is going to be, the last airline now. They're going to open up those center row seats. Is that correct?
Delta has announced that in very short order, probably within a few weeks, that they will begin to sell center seats in the airplanes. They have been the last holdout. The other airlines within the U.S. have started selling center seats some time back. So Delta has now elected to start selling center seats.
I saw that Southwest is ending its pandemic boarding procedure and going back to the kind of the traditional Southwest boarding procedure that a lot of folks are well aware of. Now, I don't fly Southwest. I didn't back in the day for business either. I was surprised and I guess I'm just slow on the uptake. Southwest is now this country's largest domestic air carrier.
I believe they are, certainly by passenger volume. Southwest flies a lot of people, and they do a good job with it. That Southwest is a very high quality airline.
Now, what about that? I wanted to talk about the safety angle of this as airlines kind of spool up as they get back to capacities, and how much of a shutdown or a narrowing of the schedule was there during the pandemic, and is that opening up? I mean, are they ready to go full bore, and are the planes ready? Do they have the crews back ready in place? Is that all set to go?
When they shut down virtually for the pandemic, and it was April a year ago, the domestic travel dropped by almost 90%. The load factors. And it was unlike anything we have ever seen in modern history in aviation. Since then, the leisure travel market has begun to trickle back, and now that trickle has turned into a release of a lot of pent-up demand for leisure travel. Business travel is still not real strong, but the leisure travel market is. So you're seeing some of the ultra low cost airlines, they're flying everything that they can. The legacy airlines are just now really getting their airplanes out of storage, recalling pilots, so that they're still a few weeks from being able to fly what was a full schedule in 2019. But this is clearly, the indications are now that you're going to see a lot more flights to a lot more cities by a lot more different airlines as they try to meet this rising demand for travel.
Okay, so let's talk safety. I mean, that's your whole world. You are the world's foremost authority maybe on aviation safety. Have these crews been able to stay sharp during this downturn? And how about the maintenance people, the folks that work on these planes? I mean, again, and you've got a background in this, you got to stay on top of this. Are they staying sharp, as I call it?
Everybody that's returning to the flight decks is going through extensive training, and the training required for airline crews is very intense, and there is a very careful review and checking process to ensure competency for the people returning back to fly in the airplanes. So yes, if they have not been flying, they received the necessary training and check rides. If they have been flying, but at a reduced rate, that still keeps the skills pretty sharp. So one of the limitations about how fast the airlines are able to rebound is actually pilot training. But the one thing that is not happening is a reduction in the quality or quantity of that training. So I'm very confident there. The maintenance side of it, these airplanes, a number of them have been in long-term storage, and there is a very clear process that they go through that the manufacturer provides for all the fluids that have to be changed, the tires that have to be changed, all of the checks that have to be done. And then the airplane is flown before it returns to revenue service. So there's a check there as well. So the airplanes returning will be in top-notch shape.
Well, let's hope that it's onward and upward, literally at this point for the aviation industry. And again, your career being in safety as an analyst, everybody thinks of safety being these flying things, but of course, in modern history, really, the aviation industry and safety are going to be thought of in a lot of ways. On the handling of this pandemic, how would you grade the aviation industry? How did they do? I mean, some people would have liked to have seen all planes grounded. Some people would like to have never had a moment's pause. I mean, they tried to find a middle ground in this some way. How do you think they performed?
I think they actually did pretty well. At the beginning, when you looked at January, February timeframes of 2020, there was a lot of uncertainty about how do we handle this problem, and at that time, how bad it was going to be. Once it became obvious that this was a worldwide pandemic and that there was going to be government mandates around the world for shutdowns, for curtailments, then it became evident that the airlines were going to have to prove to the traveling public that it was in fact safe to get on the airplanes. So they increased the sanitation, they increased the time the airplane sits on the ground so that all of this disinfection and this cleaning process could go on. They upped the requirement and training for the cabin crews, the flight attendants, to be able to deal effectively with a fewer number of people. Food service was dropped so that the contact points were reduced. So they approached it in a very analytical way, and they also did it by consensus. All the airline safety people were talking to each other, and so there was somewhat of a united front about, okay, this is the disinfection procedures we're going to use. We're not going to be serving hot food. We're only going to have little handout baggies with some water and cookies in it, and that's going to have been cleaned before it gets into the airplane. The disinfection of the lavatories, all of those things, each one of those was a small part of an overall safety program. And once you put that program into effect, history showed us that the airplanes were not a breeding ground or a transmission point for COVID-19. Part of it's just the design of the airplanes, but it was in part due to the effectiveness of how the airlines approached it.
And you, on the earlier podcast, mentioned the air handling, the air quality on the planes has always been good, and that probably was not a problem, I wouldn't think, here in recent months.
The rate at which they changed some of the filters was shortened in an effort to just be sure that the most effective filtering was available for that about 25% of the air in a modern airliner that's recycled. All the rest of it goes overboard.
Okay, so that's safety. That's your bailiwick. Now, I know you're not a finance guy, but you've got your finger on the pulse of the airline industry. Obviously, we talk about politics all the time on the podcast. One of my primary criticisms of the CARES Act is that it shot money initially, lots of it, right into the hands of the biggest corporations in all categories, all segments of society. The airline industry, no exception. It went right to those boys at the top. Did the smaller carriers, the smaller regionals, the local airlines, have they been able to make it through this? And will they be able to survive? Or do you see consolidation? Are we going to see some of these larger carriers absorbing these smaller companies?
The regional airlines faced a pretty tough situation. Some of them were getting additional government help, and some were not able to survive. So several have shut down, and they will not return. As the requirements or the opportunities, the number of flights increase, the revenue stream into the regionals will increase, probably actually faster than the legacy carriers, for the reasons that they're almost exclusively domestic. And the international travel is still very low right now. A lot of Europe is still shut down. Parts of Asia is shut down. Australia, New Zealand are just starting to reopen their borders. So international travel is still very restricted. Consequently, the legacy carriers that depend a lot on international revenue, they're not seeing that, where the regional carriers, as about 50% of flights in the United States are by regional carriers. And that's going to ramp back up pretty quickly. In the industry press, you can see a number of the regional carriers that are starting to hire pilots, new hire pilots. So this all tells me that the revenue streams are returning pretty quickly. So I think the regionals that are out there will do okay. It's just sadly that we lost several in the early stages.
Who'd have thunk it that aviation would have so many corollaries into other areas that we talk about on the podcast a lot. Politics. The other thing that we talk about a lot is climate. And before we lose you here today on a time basis, I wanted to get to you about climate change and how that's affecting the airline industry. Now, it's affected the Defense Department. The Pentagon is designated the national security priority. And I give people an example here in the great Midwest, 2019, those hellacious floods out in the western part of the state of Iowa, eastern Nebraska. Offutt Air Force Base suffered $400 million plus, almost a $500 million in damage because of unprecedented flooding. So they're looking at that and wanting to address it and deal with it. Now, what about the airline industry as a business? And then what about us as passengers? I mean, do we need to take into account climate change when it comes to flying?
Well, I think the industry already is taking into account climate change and the greenhouse gas emissions. The engines that we're seeing coming on the new airliners today, they're about 20% more efficient than the last generation, which is quite a step, but it means a reduction in greenhouse gases, an appreciable reduction. There's a lot of criticism on the aviation industry, notably the airlines, about how much fuel that they burn. But when you look at the overall greenhouse emissions compared to coal-powered power stations, things like that, it's really fairly small. But that said, there is a lot of effort by the manufacturers, both airframe and engine, and the operators to go to biosustainable fuel to continue to increase fuel efficiency, and the use of renewable energy resources. Electric aircraft, as an example, is one of the areas that's receiving a lot of attention. When you look at it from a pilot standpoint, we do see in the last few years, we've seen an increase in the number of hurricanes that pilots are dealing with blizzards. We're dealing with earlier cases of where you see spring storms earlier in the year, and the West has seen catastrophic fires, and they're still in a severe drought. So operationally, the airlines are dealing with issues that are caused by climate change literally on a daily basis. And they're doing everything possible to be a good contributor to the solutions and not part of the problem. One thing to realize too for the airlines is if you have an airport that, for example, gets flooded, you can move the airplanes. But all that ground infrastructure, the ground equipment, the jetways, all of those, which can be hundreds of millions of dollars, they're going to be right there and be damaged. So everything that the operators and the airports can do to minimize damage, that's something that is a high priority, particularly in the areas that are more storm prone. The wildfires, that's a harder problem, but they're certainly very, very aware of it. And I know that there were flights that were significantly modified, and also ground service personnel that were released from their duties so that they could go back to their families and deal with the fires on an ongoing basis. So I would say that the airlines recognize that this is a global problem and they want to be part of the solution.
Well, there's no doubt there are more and more violent storms, and they're just more violent. I don't know, maybe even since the days when you were flying full time for commercial jetliners. It seems to me like there's more tornadoes in the south, the hurricanes that you mentioned. We had this thing come through Iowa last year called a derecho, which the meteorologists kind of, what the hell is that, you know? And so I don't know if we're going to get any more of those types of things. But I guess if there's any good news is technology is always moving ahead. I mean, the technology on the planes with their Doppler radars and all that, they're better equipped certainly than even when you were flying.
Well, we had Doppler radar on the airplanes my last several years. I learned to fly with radar that was much, much, much older, very basic technology. But the newer Doppler radars, they're wonderful because they can tell you in real time if there is a wind shear that could pose a potential threat to the airplane. And it's proven effective because the last wind shear accident that we had was 1994. So, and that was in Charlotte, North Carolina. So the effectiveness of the technology, the training of the crews, and the conservative approach to thunderstorms, history has shown that has proven to be an effective mitigation for that risk.
Well, that's great. You've answered just about every question I had competently, as always, and I think it's reassuring. We've got to have confidence to take the next step to get out of this in more ways than one, and it looks like we're hopefully just breaking free. Maybe this summer will be even better. Captain, before we let you go here, I always like to give you the last word. Anything that's top of mind with you in the aviation industry that you'd like to talk about here as we wrap up this edition of Podcast by George?
I think we're seeing the industry in transition right now from a much reduced pandemic-driven industry into a responsive industry for the pent-up demand. I would encourage everyone, follow the guidelines, wear the mask, follow the boarding procedures. Let us get back to normalcy as quickly as we can, but also as safely as we can.
Yeah, that's where it's at, normal. Let's get back to normal, folks. And that's our friend Captain John Cox coming back on the Podcast by George. He's a veteran pilot, and he's on media everywhere. I'm sure you've seen him on television and on cable news and all the places where aviation news is being made. The captain is there. Thanks for coming back on, Captain. We'll talk to you again soon.
Good to see you, George. Thank you.
And folks, if you like Podcast by George, please follow us. We ask everybody to subscribe on YouTube. That's one of the best places to get the video editions. Not only subscribe, but ring that notification bell so that you find out when we've got a new episode that's dropping. And of course, Facebook is one of our bigger platforms. All you got to do is just like us there, and you'll find out when the new shows come out. And on iTunes is a great place also to get the audio versions, which are also available anywhere that podcasts are heard. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.